Well, thank you, Dr. Miletsky, for being on and talking with me about your fantastic book, Before Busing, A History of Boston's Long Black Freedom Struggle. I really appreciate your time, and this is truly a great book, and thank you again for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really it's been my a long time aspiration to be on this podcast. So,
Oh,
you're,
wow. We're starting off
yeah,
strong already.
yay! It's a fun. I'm yeah, I'm a newer fan, but a listener. I'm a
Oh,
listener.
well, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you for that as well. That means a tremendous amount to me. What I would love to start off with is like I start off with a lot of my uh, interviewees that I bring on. When did the spark of history start with you?
Yeah, wow, great question. Yeah, starting strong indeed. That's it. That is the question. I mean, um, I think, and thank you for asking that. I think as a professional sort of project or as a research project, I would say it has several possible start dates. Uh, I guess the most recent one would be around about 2010. About what is that? Oh, 13 years now.
Mhm.
I started to really get serious about writing this book and started doing the interviews and research necessary. That would be, and that coincided with I had a postdoctoral fellowship at Case Western Reserve University
Mhm.
in the history department there, and that was the sort of you know spring point, and it gave me the time and the resources to do it. So it just came at a very good time. But I could go back further and say, really, I think the first day I walked into the doors of graduate school for my doctorate in African American Studies, I went to UMass Amherst, and which is not that far from Boston,
Mhm.
and started to, very, and I mean very, sort of without any sense that I would, what I would end up really endeavoring to do, but really just reading and immersing myself in a lot of the resources while I was at UMass.
Mhm.
So, a couple of different potential start dates for this project, and you could argue is like, going back as far as when growing up in Boston, it was like kind
Yeah.
of always in the back of my mind as I see it now, looking back.
Hmm. I really appreciated this work for a number of reasons, but one is which I'm a huge fan of Willie O'Ree, the first black NHL player, and he got in Boston, and he often talked about the racism that he encountered along the way, and even in Boston. And so, reading parts of this book, it was like, wow, okay, I've heard these stories from one of my favorite hockey players, and we hear this from basketball players even to this day, and Major League Baseball players even to this day as well. And to realize the roots of those discussions goes way back is really important for a lot of us, not as historian, not just as historians, but as Americans, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. A lot, and a lot of the story about race in Boston that has been told. A lot of it has come from athletes, played in the big sports teams in Boston, and the it's. I mean, I can't tell you how many people were like, okay, you need to look at like, Willie O'Ree or other, for what you're trying to do, Zeb. You need to look at the experiences of black players in the Celtics, black players in some of the other
Hmm.
teams. It for some reason. I mean, I'm not. It's not for no reason. I mean, it's for an obvious reason in a sense that that brings a powerful African Americans into the city of Boston, in a place where the city's not that comfortable all the time with having, with a black person having that kind of power, but in its love of sports and in terms of just that way that whole thing works, it
Hmm.
ends up it ends up making for some very interesting storytelling and important testimonials about experiencing what in other words, it gave evidence in a time we couldn't see it as well to the race stuff that my book's about. And that some of the new work is highlighting was invisible in a lot of ways, but some of the people who passed through the doors, some of the sports teams made it more visible because of their presence there.
When you started to do the research, you started to put the monograph together. How far back did you want to take this story before we got to what we see as the 20th century civil rights era? How far back did you want to take the roots of that story?
Oh yeah. Well, I tell you, I didn't plan on taking it back as far as, as the book did or does
Right.
originally. I think, but I did think and knew that it's important to mention that you literally have to mention to people that slavery occurred in Boston and in Massachusetts because of some of the powerful forces that I'm described in later parts of the book, the myth making, the ways in which it's hard to see some of those things in the North and in Boston and cities like it. Because that's so powerful, you really had to just remember to mention to audiences or to people, slavery happened in Boston. Oh, that's right. Wait a minute.
Mhm.
And then that puts everything in a new context. So I guess in the back of my mind, I knew that I would. I guess I knew I was going to go back that far. Now, the more I think about it, but it was a hard pitch to make because um, that's pretty far back, and even going back to the 19th century was a little bit of a hard sell because people say, well, that's a really long, movement. No, we're not.
Mhm.
That's too far back. But because of Boston's sort of interesting story and the way that things happened, it necessitated looking back, certainly at the 19th century, and I eventually argued and felt strongly that it needed to go back to the moment the first enslaved person sets foot on the coastline of Shawmut, called by the Native Americans in Boston as we know it.
Mhm.
And that's an important moment right there. That people, and this was the thing that was very interesting is as those 11 years were passing by, and I was working on the book, I started to notice that other people were starting to ask similar questions, things that were on my mind about slavery, about how we remember it and commemorate it in Boston. Um, and the whole question of racial justice in Boston was starting to come up, and the whole part about Boston having struggling with race was part of the national conversation. I said, I got to really hurry up and get this book out there because
Right.
this is wow. I'm thinking the same things, writing about the
Mhm.
same things that I saw happening as it was going, and so the context made it important, I think, to go back that far.
Mhm. I really admired your path taken with print media in the book because we have similar arguments and debates, if you will, today about what is freedom, what is equality, as people in the 18th and early 19th century were having in their newspapers in Massachusetts and surrounding areas. And you talk about the Liberator and other newspapers in the antebellum era. What were those papers at that time and other media forms of that with letters and documents and primary sources that you found? Was that idea from others about freedom just a different way of looking at the idea of equality and freedom from a Boston perspective? Because we kind of hear about how during the Civil War, a lot of the more progressive minded soldiers came from Massachusetts, but their idea of progressive things aren't like we have today. It's not intertwined, right?
Yeah, yeah, right. Exactly. That brings to mind just the whole question of even bringing up uh, the myth making, or because it's there's so many different kinds of myths to contend with when it comes to Boston and Massachusetts. I mean, um,
Yeah.
it's not a small undertaking, to deal with it. Because why? Because Boston is the birthplace, in so many people's minds, of these kinds of ideas. Boston
Mm.
is known for them, and Massachusetts, as you say, as and that's absolutely right. Um, I always try to explain to people too that, like, everyone has a Boston in their mind, because you learn about Boston as part of American history in a way. Whether you're in Iowa or the Midwest or wherever, other parts
Mm.
of the country, you learn about Bunker Hill, you learn about the American Revolution, um, and all of these things that take place in Boston. So politics and different ideologies and ideological frameworks become a complicated question in there, also because people are, you know so educated. This is another paradox. The home of higher education, some of the best colleges and universities, um, and uh, all in the midst of, all these different sort of class uh, differences, and that kind of thing. But yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's part of the conversation. A lot of people told me, who I interviewed for the book, or read that someone else had interviewed. You hear over and over again a lot of, African Americans say, I came to Boston expecting, this was the home of progressive, thinking. This is the home of liberalism. This is the home of the abolitionist movement in the 19th century.
Mm.
So, but that does not always usually translate into the lived day-to-day experience of people, and they're often find that contrast. And so that's another way of framing this discussion, is Boston has a lot of paradoxes. These paradoxes constantly that come up, and that's one of them. People have an expectation. They're sort of able to idealize Boston and Massachusetts in that way, I think also as a show of respect, in a sense, as being one of the first, and being, this special place. But see, all of that is part of the myth making, uh, as well. But I also consider, well, what if Boston is a special? Maybe it is a special place. I don't know. Maybe Massachusetts is like, maybe there is something different. Certainly, something that's that's how a lot of people who come there, lived there, worked there, have felt about it, and so they had to deal with. So that was also something to deal with as well.
Mm.
Um, we're not, you know, uh, uh, if Boston, maybe Boston could be a city up on a hill. But the thing is, without the people who push for those ideas to be a reality, then it isn't. It has the potential, and I think that's what part of what people might see about it. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but yeah. The other thing, though, is, in any place, it's hard to we reduce things to one ideology. There certainly were lots of people, uh, that the abolitionists in Boston, which was a relatively small group,
Mm.
right,
Right.
are pushing everyone, all the other fellow Bostonians and so on, to support. But not everyone does. So we tend to equate, okay, well, that's just the home of the abolitionist movement, so everybody feels that way. No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. So there's a symbolism that's projected, and some very important and great moments about, and literally some of the architects of our democracy, of our some of our ideals in terms of what we're trying to live up to,
Mm.
hailed from the Bay State, Massachusetts, and Boston, and those names are inscribed in the part of the founding of the country itself. So it's, yeah. So there's that. I got to deal with that. Home of democracy and all of that stuff.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
heavy stuff, and I didn't take it lightly. I can see why I had to start so long ago writing this.
Right, right, right. Yeah, and especially now that we're coming upon the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, and people are looking towards Boston as this kind of place to go and remember these events that transpired there, especially if we get towards a couple years from now with Bunker Hill and the siege of Boston and such. Uh, I think that our times are going to change how some of us see that idea and that time a little bit differently, and I'm looking forward to the discussions that we're going to have. I'm not afraid of these kinds of discussions that are going to transpire because it needs to happen. Most of your book, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of your book deals with the late 19th century and into the 20th century. And there are some amazing icons, I would say, of Black freedom who came through or spent some time in Boston or hailed from Boston. And I didn't really realize the list until I read your book. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I forgot. They spent time in Boston. Booker T. Washington and Du Bois and others. Uh, how do these massive icons play into or come into, I shouldn't say play into, that sounds derogatory, but come into this story of Black freedom movements in Boston? How did they help that progressive movement kind of get rolling in the post Civil War years?
Yeah, so I, in writing this book, I really let um, the sort of oral stories, oral traditions, and sort of stories about Boston kind of be my guide in how I wanted to write it, what I wanted to focus on. And occasionally, a lot of times you'd hear people point out, some of the greats, the big names,
Mhm.
obviously William Monroe Trotter, because he was from Boston, grew up in Hyde Park, grew up in, so that was, obviously, but Du Bois, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, or Du Bois, sometimes called, um, was a Massachusetts man, but he's from Western Massachusetts. Grew up in grew up in Great Barrington. So um, uh, now Washington obviously is the exceptional, member who's not has no Massachusetts ties, but wanted to, uh, quite desperately, quite interestingly. We just had so many different, sort of his eyes on Boston in many different ways in terms of his organizing and his national leadership. um, must have seen, I reasoned, just based on, you know sort of my own kind of thinking and observation and reading, putting it all together, you realize that Washington just had this sort of, like, his eyes on Boston in many different ways. He founds the National Negro Business League there. He had all kinds of friends and sort of even, people he relied on to sort of help to solidify his sort of grip on national leadership and influence, and his sort of, in terms of power, the building his power base. So I just found that interesting. I didn't really ever, no one's ever really talked about it that much, it
Mhm.
seemed to me. But I saw the confluence of these three men, and also people like Ida B. Wells and others. It wasn't just the male leaders, but these, sort of men of history and men of affairs, and ideas, and journalism, and all of the rest, all sort of seem to sort of find this crossroads in Boston. And so So occasionally people would point those kinds of things out. Oh, well, I mean, Du Bois was at Harvard, and Harvard's right across the river. He's there. He's around, um, and it's so I found, and then I started to realize that he and William Monroe Trotter, really conceive of the Niagara movement in Boston and in their time working together. So it's like, oh, that's interesting.
Mhm.
That to all the naysayers who, sort of kind of like, well, the Boston doesn't have like this sort of connection to people don't think of Boston as a black space and as a sort of as one of the cities we think of as like cities that have sort of the powerhouse names. New
Mhm.
York and Chicago and Washington D.C. all have individuals who are, who sort of were sort of connected to to that idea. But yeah, Boston has its its white founding fathers and mothers, and black
Mhm.
founding fathers and mothers too, that
Mhm.
were quite important in terms of the national Afro-American struggle.
Mhm. Can you give some background or a little bit of insight into the man who was William Trotter? Because a lot of people have heard of Du Bois or Dubois, and a lot of people heard Booker T. Washington. A lot of people hadn't heard of Trotter, and they will in your book. What was the man like, and what did he see as the path forward towards equality and true freedom?
Yeah, not an easy question to answer, it turns
Oh.
out. Yeah, because well, he's very mercurial is the mind of William Monroe Trotter.
Yeah.
He was. This is exactly why I wanted to, write about him as much as I could,
Yeah.
because yeah, he is sort of, I think more recently, people are starting to really appreciate and understand the vision that he had and that he had quite early on. And it's a mix of different traditions that don't are not found in one person.
Right.
I guess is one way to put it. But but you know, he's part of he grows up, sort of as a member of the sort of black elite, as a young prodigy in a sense, to of to inherit that kind of s- sort of positioning that his family already had a strong foothold in, especially his because of his father. At one point, so the Trotters were probably one of the more wealthy black families in Boston, probably if not the most, well, certainly up there. And so uh, Trotter is one thing people need to know is, he was by the time of his sort of prime as a leader and speaker, thinker, and writer. He's kind of a bit of a sort of almost like a working man's kind of hero. Really, ready to dust it up and literally go to physical in times. You
Mhm.
just had this very very unique kind of approach toward fighting for the race, and that you know. So man, we got to understand a little bit more about this person. I and so I wanted to try to do that a little bit, and it's kind of something I've been chasing after for quite a long time because when I first reading about William Monroe Trotter, mostly in during graduate school, um, you start to realize there's some clues behind this very unique brand of leadership that comes straight from Boston, and is so sort of at once uh, the embodiment of what the Boston Black elite kind of leadership envisioned and wanted to bring about and create. But Trotter sort of, uh, kind of parts ways with the track or sort of that he was supposed to be on, which was to become, wealthy gentleman of means himself, And because he goes to Harvard,
Mhm.
he's an excellent student. He's a standout mind, and attends Harvard around about the same time, as I mentioned in the book, that Du Bois is also there, um, and then Washington is going to be receiving an honorary degree at Harvard himself, and at a time when they were all three of them would be there in the same space. So,
Mm.
uh, but so that's one thing people need to know about Trotter, is that he was sort of meant to be sort of this part of this elite that he kind of rejects and decides instead to use all his resources, intellectual, political, um, educational, and financial, to do something else instead, which is to uplift the race in the way that he felt strongly about. And education, turns out, I think it was sort of always there and hiding in plain sight. This is a big part of what he is fighting for.
Mm.
Um, so there's just so much there, but anyway, to the extent people talked about a lot about William Monroe Trotter, especially at least when I was in graduate school, or I'd say in the last few decades, is in relationship to Booker T. Washington, and uh, I saw two things there. He also has a deep, abiding friendship with W.B. Du Bois,
Mm.
one that also parted ways. So this is that intellectual history is so interesting in terms of the politics, the connections, personal, professional, and so on, that connect all of these people. That it becomes a very small world of degree of separation uh, between them, and that ends up because of who they are and because of what they represent, ends up having major implications for African Americans nationally, and certainly in Boston itself.
Mm. You talk about them being at Harvard and their education and such. Education and schoolhouse politics, if you will, is at the heart of a lot of this work. Just having proper education, or having access to education, or having a desegregated form of segregation. We still hear about this even to this day, where we're having discrepancies in how different schools are getting uh, their incomes and being able to in the public school system. How did the people of the early 20th century try to make things better for uh, the next generation, if you will, the people who learn from Du Bois, the people who learn from Trotter? How did the next generation kind of try to make this more accessible for the future, for the everyday person, for the person who's on the streets of Boston, who's working those blue collar jobs and trying to make ends meet?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There certainly is a connection. There's connections to be made between sort of the stuff that was being fought for then. Um, I think just the idea of having of Black folks pushing for their rights, that those rights were available to them, and using their educations and their intellectual sort of know-how, I suppose, to reinterpret and reimagine American democracy as a place that there was a claim to be uh, staked, in that sense, that they had to um, uh, push for push for those rights, or just the idea of what we call civil rights today.
Mm.
Essentially, it just really kind of comes out of a lot of their thinking and ideas, and their sort of understanding of the Constitution, and other documents that brought about those rights, if in an imagined way, that could become and made manifest real. And that is the debate, between Washington and Du Bois and Trotter, with Du Bois and Trotter both sort of on the same side of that debate themselves, and then eventually they will also part ways in terms of the best way to go about doing that.
Mm.
Um, Du Bois goes on to found the NAACP, and Trotter uh, would have been involved in that, and but had great objections about the idea of blacks and whites, not necessarily blacks and whites working together, but an organization with white leadership that was pushing for black rights. And that's kind of what the NAACP, that's not kind of, that is what the NAACP was for at least the first 10 years of its existence. So that makes these are the kinds of things that leave people scratching their heads about Trotter. This is a very enigmatic figure,
Hmm. Mhm.
misunderstood in some ways.
Mhm.
But anyway, yeah, I think that that translates. There is a through line I felt in the sort of black traditions of Boston, such that they were and are, and see, like a lot of the earlier work on African Americans um, in Boston, if you know, dealt with the elite, were studies of the black elite group. Some of the important books that were coming out in the 1990s and things like that.
Mhm.
And so it made sense. It's important to look at it through that lens. And on that basis, you see by yeah, in the 20th century, as America's moving through things like the Great Depression, um, the period between the World War One, World War Two, um, there is still an effort to fight for rights, but they they turn a little bit more toward economic
Mhm.
issues and labor organizing in that period. Don't buy where you can't work campaigns,
Right.
um, and I think organizations that had been kind of formed by the more elite groups like the NAACP in Boston. NAACP retains that kind of sort of the sort of what it was and what it is, and you see and I mentioned in the book in the 1930s and 40s, the Boston NAACP sort of falls out of favor with many with the black masses who are struggling to work, struggling to find jobs, struggling to survive, and dealing more with other issues for the moment. Of which, but see, education is always in the background because that is the route to economic, strength and salvation, and on a personal level. If, and so, in all those ways, uh, people just sort of are pushing and fighting for a more well-rounded way of life that allows them to stretch their own sort of limits in terms of a fuller sense of democracy and what it felt like in the city where it's supposed to breathe most freely, which is Boston.
Mm.
Because
Mhm.
with all that
Mhm.
talk of it's all around you, with all that talk of of important moments of fighting for freedom and so on, and the role that history plays in Boston itself, um, that you know everybody's bitten by the bug, and
Right.
yeah, and wants to you know lay claim to those traditions too. And so I saw a through line of a black sort of, sometimes from the elite point of view, but more often kind of there's a black New England, a black Yankee tradition in Massachusetts as well. It's just as rich and somewhat underexplored,
Mhm.
that I wanted to try to. Uh, that's the attempt anyway, is to try to run that sort of thread.
Mhm.
And along the way, you find that there were groups and organizations who were thinking that way. My supposition was correct. I didn't. So when I first started, I wasn't sure,
Mhm.
and I found things along the way that sort of were reassuring and said, okay, think, I think this is an important story to tell,
Mhm.
and that fight, whether it's for education or for an economic sense, for housing, for uh, fighting against the strong traditions of redlining and segregation and so on. not in Mississippi, but in a city in the north, in the northern city, Boston, is just, very interesting.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. Yeah, I really admire that because I've heard far too many people say, "Well, that's a Southern thing," meaning Jim Crow. That's the South. That didn't happen here, or it couldn't happen here, and it's like, well, yeah, well, you haven't talked to the right people yet, or you haven't looked at the right documents yet because it's there, right? And this book really underscores that in a new way, and I really appreciated how you put it to you gave you tipped your cap to the icons, if you will, of Black freedom movements, but also the people who were doing the legwork on the streets, and some of those you may have. I think you interviewed one of them, if not a few of them, were involved in the Black Panther movement in the 1960s, and that really, for myself personally, my outlook on my local area changed when I met someone who was a Black Panther at one time. And I'm like, wow, I didn't know that we had Black Panthers in my area of the world back in the day. And my whole, it was like a light bulb moment. The light bulb went on. I'm like, wait, I'm missing something here. And you bring up the Black Panther movement and party in Boston and how it operated. Can you give a little bit of insight into their efforts in Boston?
yeah, yeah, sure. I left no stone unturned, as you could
You
tell. I mean,
didn't.
we just we no. I'm sure that, and yet there was it's still it's hard to get at everything, but we certainly mentioned a lot.
Mhm.
And yeah, um, yeah, I mean that became kind of interesting, thing to do to yeah, the subtitle is a history of Boston's long Black freedom struggle.
Right.
Well, what is what is that long Black freedom struggle, and I wanted to push ideas about periodization, and also while at the same time, because the most of the reaction I've gotten from people who have read the book, they're like, we had no idea,
Yeah.
we had never thought about it
Mhm.
or heard of half of this, and then um, and I'm not surprised about that because I mean, when you set out to, if our presumption in the beginning is that there has been a strong myth making power around the North and around, how because Boston's a part of the American narrative story, um, there are sort of like phenomenon there that are universal that kind of happen in other places. And so if we agree about that these things make it difficult to see things in Boston like slavery, like all, that sort of we're still in many ways kind of stuck, not stuck, but in the Civil War framework, the North as being, this sort of good place that,
Mhm.
the victorious and saves the Union and the country and 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 so those things are really powerful. So so in writing against that, it's sort of like I think I'm just going to mention a lot of things,
Mhm.
even if I didn't get a chance to talk about them in as much depth as I would have liked, because I think that because of that stuff, it's just sort of hidden. And yes, we had the Black Panthers in Boston too, and a very interesting kind of story there. And I wanted to really understand the period, I guess, of Black Power, also, in addition to all the other stuff that I was writing about, which is mostly the freedom, which you would call a freedom sort of movement approach, but one that, like, as the country makes that turn into the period, where it wasn't just about the freedom movement, but after 1965 and Watts, you have, major sort of revolt and rebellion. Um, and it strikes me that a lot of that has to do with the project of integration in a sense. It's like this is why does everything blow up in 1965? It's like the Civil Rights Act is 1964,
Mhm.
right? And the Voting Rights Act is 1965. It's once this project of integration really is achieved and really begins, all of a sudden you have everything blowing up, and it's like, okay,
Mhm.
that's interesting to me. And so then how does that look in Boston? So yeah, the Black Panthers were is something that hadn't been written about a ton, but a little bit. And as I've spoken to other people now, the sense was in Boston. They had the Black Panthers, but they weren't like the other Panthers like in other chapters
Mm.
across the country. Um, and that I found that to be somewhat sort of true. Um, they're 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 a little more tied. A lot of the students from neighboring universities were part of it. It had a sort of tie and connection with the college and student groups. Um, and they were certainly insistent, and they were certainly just as militant, but more in a sense in terms of ideas and intellectual kind of debates more than shootouts in the
Mhm.
street or anything like that.
Mhm.
But I heard a lot of interesting stories about the Panther office on Blue Hill Avenue in Boston, and enough stories to let me know that they were there in a way that really did sort of offer an umbrella of sort of protection to the community in terms of any of its sort of sort of relationships with the police, and that turns out to be more important than I thought when I first started writing the book,
Mm.
because like I just always felt like some of these different things were a little bit misunderstood. Um, but my research and stuff that I ended up finding were affirmations, and realizing that much of what the Black community, say, like post 1965, and really by 67, 68, certainly
Mhm.
in Boston, were dealing with was a an effort to find some sort of self-determination and an effort to determine their own destiny, um, and to do so by kind of controlling their communities. And so that was the legacy of, I think, of the Panthers in Boston. They end up sort of helping some of the more visionary leaders who who were concerned about the police presence in the Black community of Boston. I mention this because in 1967 you had this riot that took place, and I guess you would call it wasn't a riot, but it was uh, some welfare mothers who were organizing in Roxbury, and who were trying to do a sort of sit-in in the welfare office that was located there, and that turned into like this major sort of sort of scene and of rioting and violence in 1967, and a clash with the police. In 1968, James Brown was scheduled to do his concert in Boston, and that's the chapter that I think that you're talking about,
Mm.
uh, about the Panthers. Um, and it's a whole story I mentioned in the book. It's been told in many places, but the way that's always talked about is the night James Brown saved Boston, because it kept it was the vision of the mayor at the time, Mayor White, to really to avoid any kind of uprising or violence that was happening as a result of the death of Martin Luther King Jr. from happening in Boston. But what nobody mentions is that they were really mostly worried about that kind of violence happening in downtown Boston,
Mm.
not as much in the Black community itself, where violence did end up happening. Um, but so the Panthers and other groups like that were kind of savvy in that sense. And um, for instance, um, they sort of uh, find a lot of different ways to sort of patrol their own community, control it, offer up a substitute in some ways to law enforcement, um, uh, because the leadership there didn't want to encourage the presence of police in the community itself. So in the it's all mentioned in the book, but in the some of the violence in moments that took place, um, there was always a sense of, okay, we're going to control this or curtail it ourselves so as not to invite the Boston police, to sort of be part of a permanent fixture in the Black community.
Mhm.
And so that's a good example to me of like the kind of sort of enlightened, really, really intelligent kind of leadership from Black leadership that is just as likely to have maybe gone to Harvard University themselves, or who came to Boston to attend those university and schools. So as a result, the Black community of Boston has benefited from having sort of a very sort of like really smart leadership, in terms of some of the in terms of some of its relationships with the city and some of the larger power interests there, that
Mhm.
that I would not have necessarily assumed unless I had a chance to read the stuff from the Panthers and what they were thinking, how they operated. Um, one of the things one of the things they tried to protest was the founding of a they put a public library in what was then called Dudley Square, and combination, city police uh, station right there, which, if you grew up in my time, everybody remembers this library and police station. You never thought of it, but they could see down the line. They were like, the more city facilities and city operations that end up in Dudley, in Roxbury, then the city will be a permanent presence here. And lo and behold, that has
Mhm.
actually happened. They're about to move the whole Boston Public Schools headquarters right to
Wow.
those areas in Roxbury.
Wow. They foresaw that. They knew what was going to happen.
Well,
Uh,
that's what they said at the time.
yeah,
People said, "Oh, that's crazy." Like, no, what are you talking
right.
about? But they were right.
You're right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. You said about doing oral histories with some people, doing oral interviews and such. Uh, who was someone who really stood out to you during that process? Because a lot of us who've done oral histories are like, wow, that one was the one that was like, I did not expect something that was said, or I got something extra out of that one. Were there any oral histories that you did for this book where you're like, wow, didn't expect that, or something that wasn't planned there?
Oh, yeah. Quite a
Yeah.
few.
Yeah.
Quite a few. One name that stands out is a gentleman by the name of Hubie Jones, and he is sort of a legend, in the Boston experience, and um, he did lots of things, but he really, he's known for he was a scholar. He was a professor at BU School of Social Work, and a lot of other work. His legacy is major in Boston, and but he was also there as part of the real sort of civil rights years and process, in terms of fighting the Boston School Committee. Was an
Mm,
eyewitness, and so that I don't think people necessarily, sort of like, if you grew up in my time period, who that name as someone important, as somebody who was an important Black leader. And we had a long list of people like that: Mel King, Byron Rushing, um, all these sort of folks who if I didn't interview them myself, I was able to benefit from someone else's interviewing of them. And but I spoke to Hubie Jones myself, and some of the stories he told me about those nights, in terms of their sitting in and protesting at the Boston School Committee in those meetings, and some of the just wild stuff that took place as passions, you know, have a habit of doing, kind of with these issues were so sort of powerful. And I think that I guess by definition, the powers that be um, are, are going to sort of play the role that they play. And part of that role is not understanding that there is a powerful freedom movement, knocking on the other side of the door, insistent upon rights that, in a universal sense, perhaps, yeah, in a universal sense, are part of the, sort of on the side of the place we would call human rights.
Hmm.
And so they're going to win, like they're right, good and evil sense about, about about some of the things they're pushing for. And so, but the powers that be don't necessarily see things that way, and they think they're right too. I mean that's the sense I got from
Hmm.
studying and looking at a lot of this. They had no doubt that their struggle was important and right.
Mhm.
Um, but so without the the kind of the villains in terms of our in the civil rights struggle, you can think of them, and I guess in the South, the Bull Connors and the different people who kind of George, Wallace and that kind of thing. Segregationists, I mean to say,
Mhm.
um, you know, you in order for there to be a kind of there'll always be those kinds of people, and so Boston has that in terms of you know some of the characters that make up this drama. Louise Day Hicks being sort of the main person that people usually mention. She was the president of the Boston School Committee during that time. And anyway, so what he was telling me, some wild stories, things that would have been very hard to get out of just the text alone. Like for instance, he was explaining to me, once they were upstairs meeting with the committee or sitting in, they could hear people singing freedom songs from outside. Um, some of them, many of the freedom songs come from church hymns with,
Mhm.
they changed the words out a little bit. And so it just made me think, wow, I would love to, be able to hear that, what that must have sounded like, into the night and stuff as their voices were rising. And he had a way of explain of telling the story that made you feel like you were there.
Mm.
And and I just thought to myself, wow, I just don't think people think about Boston as having had a vibrant, powerful sort of, kind of rooted organic civil rights movement, just as sort of powerful, just as mythic as the one that we know about, happening in the South. And because I had never really, I'm like I had no, I knew about this, but I just realized I don't think a lot of people will remember, how did Boston get to that point of dealing with school desegregation in the first place?
Mhm.
It's because of this, you know, this insistent, persistent, well organized, you know, uh, vibrant civil rights movement of parents, children, and sort of individuals who love freedom and see it in their own way.
Mhm.
And he was telling me this other story about how blocking the they were they were blocking the entrance way for the committee members, if I remember correctly, going in. And this one guy, and I tell this story in the book, this one guy did like a football thing, as Huey told me, where he did, like, he tried to like jump over the defense into the end zone kind of thing, into the door. and may have revved up and did like it was. So I was like, wow, that's amazing. Those some of
Mhm.
those stories are quite uh that was all unexpected. And but that made me realize how little this story is actually told in that way.
Mhm.
And a lot of it just has to do with um, the busing and school desegregation was in the 70s, and this stuff is all in the 60s. The Boston, when the struggle first began in the 1960s, Boston had about 12 black teachers in the entire Boston public school system.
Wow.
No principals, and I mean, 12. So this is, I
Wow.
mean, yeah, this is with a city of, Boston didn't have the biggest black population, but certainly, enough of a percentage of the population that where their children were enrolled in classes, enrolled in those schools that needed to be, in needing an education,
Mhm.
and um, so anyway, so that's kind of like some of the stuff that I remember. The other thing I got out of it too, because I remember actually that was a powerful day. I remember hanging up the phone, just like wow.
Mhm.
Um, Him explaining also that these people, like Louise Day Hicks, um, had actually worked with the black community. Previous up to that, there was been no indication of her previously of having the kind of opposition that ended up taking place to the
Mhm.
movement. She had worked with black organizations and black leadership. In fact, they were fairly certain that they would be able to. They were actually very shocked and surprised that there was this level of opposition to what they were asking for and what they were looking for. And the issue that she objected to the most was their use of the term segregation. And they talked about Boston being segregated. And she tells them very clearly, if you continue to use that word, I will not, we will not, be able to work together. We will not be able to meet together. And the movement refused to back down upon that. And that's really what this, you know, and why is that? Because they said, listen, this is Boston. We're Massachusetts, not Mississippi, right? We don't have segregation. How dare you use a word like Jim Crow or segregation in reference to noble and great Boston,
Mhm.
and so it was their unwillingness to push back on the myth.
Mhm.
That's how powerful those myths are, and so some of the stories he told me helped me to understand that better.
Mhm. Well, you told some fantastic stories in the book, and I really, really appreciate everything you had to say in there, and really makes me think differently about some things, including the next time I walk the Freedom Trail in Boston, and it's going to be like, okay, let's look at this a little bit differently. That's for me personally to think about while I'm going through there. But Dr. Miletsky, what is next for you? What stories are you working on telling next?
Yeah, well, I want to sort of collect and do like a combined volume with some of the newer voices and new work that's coming out that's similar to my
Mm,
own about Boston. And there's a lot of amazing graduate students and younger scholars who are working on pulling some of the strands that I only just talked about a little bit or alluded to or was able to allude to in my book, and their work has been ongoing. There's a new series that's coming out on some of that stuff on Black New England from UMass Press, for instance. And
mm,
so for me, I'm trying to put together kind of an edited volume that tells some of that story.
mm,
Um, Uh, and who knows? I think that some of my early work, my dissertation, looked at interracial marriage in Boston and the sort of struggle that Black leadership in particular had in terms of uh, in terms of fighting for those issues, sort of interracial marriage is a dilemma, the dilemma of interracial marriage, as I call it, in another piece that came out as a journal article. So I'm thinking about, possibly turning that into a book length study,
Hmm.
and looking at some of the issues that come up in Massachusetts around that issue.
Hmm. That'd be amazing. I want to read that one too. So I'll be sure
All
to reach.
right.
I'll be sure to reach out when that time comes. But
Excellent. Excellent.
uh, Dr. Miletsky, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for everything, and thank you for an amazing book that's really helped me see Boston a little bit differently.
Oh, well, that means a lot. And thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.